Hey friends, imagine this. The Nile glows beneath a midnight sky, and inside a temple of gold, a pharaoh stands naked before the gods. A priest whispers the words of creation as incense fills the air, because in ancient Egypt, sex wasn't pleasure. It was power. Kings were forced to reenact the birth of the universe. Queens were worshipped as living goddesses, and what they did behind those temple walls blurred the line between the sacred and the obscene. These weren't lovers, they were creators. Every act was a ritual, every union, a prayer to keep the cosmos alive. So before you scroll, like and subscribe if you love uncovering the forbidden truths history tried to bury. No, let's step into the shadows of Egypt's most powerful and most scandalous gods on earth. In ancient Egypt, sexuality was not a matter of private pleasure, but a cornerstone of theology, politics, and cosmology. The rise and fall of the Nile, the lifeblood of the Egyptian world, was understood as a reflection of divine fertility. The Egyptian king, or Pharaoh, was believed to be the mediator between the gods and humanity, ensuring that fertility, abundance, and cosmic order were continually renewed. Every sexual symbol, ritual, and myth attached to the pharaoh served to maintain this fragile equilibrium. The Egyptian creation myths, particularly the Heliopolitan theology, established the foundation for this worldview. According to the myth, the god Atum emerged from the primordial waters and created the first divine pair, Shu and Tefnut, through an act of self-generation. Texts describe this act as one of masturbation or spitting, with each variation symbolically representing the expulsion of creative force. The myth was not viewed as obscene or anthropomorphic indulgence, but as a profound statement of cosmic logic. Creation began through the self-sufficiency of divine sexuality. In the Egyptian language, the word for hand was grammatically feminine, implying that even the masculine act of creation contained a hidden feminine element. Thus, gender duality existed within unity, and sexual generation symbolized divine completeness. This theological precedent shaped Egyptian kingship. The pharaoh was often portrayed as the earthly manifestation of Horus and, by extension, the physical embodiment of divine potency. Titles such as Mighty Bull of his mother and iconography showing the king with a bull's tail reinforced the connection between virility, strength, and divine legitimacy. These symbols were not metaphors of personal desire, but markers of political theology. Fertility and potency were equated with the stability of the realm. As long as the king was strong and fertile, Egypt would remain fertile as well. The god Min served as the most explicit representation of divine sexuality and fertility. His cult, centered in Koptos and Akhmim, predates the unification of Egypt. Min was commonly depicted with one arm raised holding a flail, symbol of authority, and his other hand grasping an erect phallus. To the ancient Egyptians, this image did not provoke embarrassment but reverence. It signified Min's role as the lord of the erect phallus and giver of all life. His connection with agricultural cycles, particularly the harvest, symbolized the unity between human sexuality and the fertility of the land. Lettuce, a plant that exudes milky sap when cut, became sacred to Min for its obvious sexual symbolism. The intertwining of sexuality and kingship reached its height in rituals such as the Sed festival. Celebrated typically after 30 years of a monarch's reign, the festival renewed the king's physical and divine vitality. The ceremony included acts of running, lifting sacred emblems, and symbolic union with the goddess. These actions publicly displayed the king's strength and virility, reaffirming his suitability to continue ruling. The Sed festival was thus both political propaganda and theological necessity, ensuring that the balance between divine fertility and earthly prosperity remained unbroken. Rituals of divine conception also formed a central component of royal ideology. In the mortuary temple of Hatshepsut at Deir el-Bahri, wall reliefs depict the god Amun visiting Queen Amos in the form of her husband, Thutmose I, to father Hatshepsut. The narrative legitimized her unprecedented claim to the throne by grounding it in divine will. Similar scenes appear in the temples of later pharaohs, such as Amenhotep III and Ramesses II, where the conception of royal offspring by a god assured their divine right to rule. These depictions were not representations of human desire, but theological affirmations that connected human reproduction with cosmic regeneration. Later dynasties extended the theology of divine fertility into political practice through royal intermarriage. Sibling marriage within the royal family, particularly under the Ptolemies, was seen not as moral transgression, but as a sacred imitation of the gods, who often married their sisters in mythic tradition. The practice was meant to preserve divine bloodlines, symbolically maintaining the purity of the royal essence. Modern genetic studies, however, such as those on the family of Tutankhamun, have revealed the biological consequences of such unions, evidence of deformities and hereditary disorders consistent with generations of inbreeding. These physical outcomes testify to the dangerous intersection of theology and biology in royal Egypt. Sexuality in pharaonic culture cannot therefore be viewed through the moral categories of the modern world. What might appear as strange or taboo practices were, to the Egyptians, acts of cosmic maintenance. Through ritualized sexual symbolism, the pharaoh enacted the balance of creation, ensuring that the Nile would rise, the crops would grow, and the gods would remain in harmony with humankind. In the Egyptian worldview, every act of procreation echoed Atum's first act of creation. To sustain Egypt's fertility, the king had to continually perform the divine drama of sex, power, and creation on behalf of the entire cosmos. The cult of Min demonstrates the explicit union of sexuality and kingship in Egyptian theology. His image, standing erect, flail raised, and phallus exposed, expressed the perpetual readiness of the divine body to create and renew life. During the harvest season, processions honoring Min featured priests carrying statues of the god, while the pharaoh himself offered sheaves of grain and lettuce, reinforcing his role as the intermediary who secured the land's fertility. These rituals were deeply public, functioning not as erotic spectacles, but as agricultural invocations. The erect phallus was a hieroglyph of renewal, not indulgence. Though some modern writers have speculated that the pharaoh might have ritually ejaculated into the Nile to ensure its flooding, direct evidence for such an act remains unsubstantiated. The textual and archaeological record indicates that the idea of self-fertilization belonged to divine myth, not royal ritual. Nevertheless, the king's role as the guarantor of cosmic fertility was expressed through analogous performances, physical, symbolic, and repetitive, that reenacted divine creation. The said festival exemplified this reenactment of divine potency. The aging monarch demonstrated continued vitality. The queen often participated as a symbol of renewal, embodying the feminine counterpart essential to cosmic balance. Artistic depictions of Amenhotep III and Queen Tai, for example, show her holding palm ribs, symbols of longevity and cyclical time, suggesting that royal union represented the synchronization of human rule with natural rhythms. Royal ideology also linked sexuality to divinity through myths of conception. In temple reliefs, the god Amun is shown impregnating royal women to produce the divine heir. These narratives provided theological legitimacy to rulers such as Hatshepsut and Amenhotep III, reinforcing the idea that the king was not born of ordinary human passion, but of divine will. The imagery of divine conception was thus a visual theology, establishing political authority through mythic reproduction. Epithets such as bull of his mother illustrate how fertility language permeated royal identity. The phrase, recurring in pyramid texts and royal inscriptions, denoted both virility and dynastic continuity. It symbolized the monarch as the progenitor of his own lineage, the one who continually renewed his mother's line, the royal house, through divine strength. Such phrases carried no psychological connotation, but reflected a sophisticated agricultural metaphor of cyclical regeneration. In later centuries, the concept of royal sexuality evolved into more institutionalized forms. The office of the god's wife of Amun, often held by royal women, combined spiritual authority with political influence. These women were considered ritual consorts of the god Amun, and were often required to remain celibate, adopting heirs rather than bearing them. The position allowed royal women to wield economic and ceremonial power, demonstrating how sexuality in Egypt could be transformed into a mechanism of governance without physical expression. The Ptolemaic dynasty, inheriting this complex heritage, institutionalized sibling marriage as an overt expression of divinity. Ptolemy II's marriage to his sister Arsinoe II established a precedent that subsequent rulers followed. To the Egyptian populace, this practice echoed divine unions such as those of Isis and Osiris, reinforcing the sacred identity of the royal family. To the Greeks, it projected a distinctively Egyptian legitimacy rooted in antiquity. However, as genetic evidence from earlier dynasties suggests, these unions carried biological costs that the ancients could not measure, but whose traces remain visible in mummified remains. Egyptian sexual practices associated with kingship were, therefore, inseparable from theology and governance. The pharaoh's body was not his own. It was a vessel of the cosmos, a ritualized conduit through which the forces of fertility, creation, and renewal flowed. Through festivals, divine unions, and symbolic language, the monarchy made visible the metaphysics of sex and state, where every act of creation, real or represented, affirmed Egypt's place in the eternal cycle of life. Among the many peculiarities of Egyptian royal life, none perplexes the modern observer more than the deliberate practice of incest within the royal household. Yet within the intellectual and religious framework of ancient Egypt, sibling marriage was neither scandalous nor deviant, it was divine. It drew its precedent from the gods themselves, and reflected the conviction that the pharaoh's bloodline was a direct extension of divine essence. The union of brother and sister on the throne was a symbolic reenactment of the heavenly pairings of Isis and Osiris, Geb and Nut, and Shu and Tefnut. By maintaining the unity of divine blood, Egyptian monarchs sought to preserve both cosmic and dynastic purity. The earliest textual allusions to sibling unions appear in the Middle Kingdom, though they became more frequent during the New Kingdom and reached their height under the Ptolemies. In earlier dynasties, the king commonly married royal women of high status, sometimes half-sisters or cousins, as a means of consolidating political alliances within the court. By the time of Amenhotep I and his successors, the notion that the royal household itself embodied a microcosm of divine order had taken deep root. The royal family's intermarriage was not a matter of lust, but of ideology. Egyptian art and ritual rarely distinguished between the sacred and the sensual, for both served as vessels through which the gods manifested their eternal order. Under the Ptolemaic dynasty, this ideology reached its most explicit form. The Macedonian rulers, who inherited the Egyptian throne after the conquest of Alexander the Great, quickly discovered that their legitimacy depended on cultural adaptation. Ptolemy II of Philadelphus married his full sister, Arsinoe II, setting a precedent for subsequent generations. To the Greek world, the union was shocking. To the Egyptians, it signified a restoration of divine pattern. The royal siblings styled themselves as the brother and sister gods, and their marriage was sanctified through public cult. Coins, inscriptions, and temples depicted them as the new Isis and Osiris, deities who embodied both resurrection and fertility. Through this calculated blending of Greek dynastic custom and Egyptian mythic symbolism, the Ptolemies transformed incest into a political language that spoke directly to the Egyptian heart. The social logic underlying royal incest was twofold. On the one hand, it restricted the circulation of power. On the other, it created a visual theology of purity, an unbroken lineage linking the pharaoh to the gods without contamination from mortal blood. The practice, however, exacted physical and genetic costs. Modern DNA analysis of royal mummies, such as the 18th dynasty lineage of Tutankhamun, reveals high levels of consanguinity. The evidence suggests that his parents were siblings, a relationship that produced a frail heir suffering from congenital deformities, cleft palate and clubfoot. The young king's early death, along with his documented physical ailments, testifies to the biological consequences of a theology that equated holiness with homogeneity. Royal incest was thus less an act of desire than a ritual strategy, a means of fusing politics, religion, and biology into a single expression of divine continuity. Yet alongside these public unions existed a world of more private and pragmatic sexual politics. The Egyptian royal harem, often misunderstood through modern lenses of sensuality and decadence, was an institution of administrative complexity rather than mere indulgence. The term harem did not exist in Egyptian vocabulary. The ancient equivalent, perkena, referred to a residence or estate dedicated to royal women. It functioned as a self-contained microcosm of the palace, housing not only wives and concubines, but also servants, officials, musicians, and guards. Within the harem, sexual hierarchy mirrored political hierarchy. The great royal wife occupied the highest rank, her status secured through both lineage and ritual role. Lesser wives and concubines, many drawn from noble families or foreign courts, served diplomatic purposes as much as personal ones. Their presence symbolized Egypt's dominion over its neighbors. Marriages with Mitanni, Babylonian, or Hittite princesses bound treaties with the soft cords of kinship, ensuring peace through shared blood. The foreign women, however, were rarely elevated to the highest title, for only an Egyptian-born consort could embody the sacred feminine necessary for ritual kingship. Despite its ceremonial function, the harem could become a crucible of intrigue. The most famous example is the harem conspiracy against Rameses III in the 12th century BCE. The plot, preserved in the judicial papyrus of Turin, describes how Tiye, a secondary wife, conspired with palace officials and magicians to assassinate the pharaoh and place her son Pentuer on the throne. The conspiracy failed, but its details expose the latent tensions within royal sexuality. Desire, jealousy, and ambition, ordinarily sublimated into divine imagery, could erupt into lethal human drama. The conspirators were executed. Pentuer was forced to take his own life. The episode illustrates how the erotic order that underpinned kingship could, when destabilized, threaten the very foundations of the state. Sexuality in the royal court thus operated at multiple levels: theological, biological, political, and psychological. The king's relationships were public symbols, yet they also unfolded within the closed spaces of the palace, where rival queens and concubines vied for influence through their sons. The womb became a political battleground. Each male child represented not only potential succession, but also the perpetuation of cosmic order. Infertility or impotence in this context carried more than personal shame. It signified the possible breakdown of Ma'at, the principle of universal balance that governed Egyptian thought. The broader population viewed these royal dramas through the lens of mythology rather than morality. The pharaoh's bedroom was understood as a stage upon which the eternal struggle between fertility and chaos was enacted. If the king failed to produce heirs, it was interpreted not as human weakness, but as a sign that cosmic harmony had been disturbed. Rituals, prayers, and festivals sought to restore the balance, reinforcing the link between sexual potency and divine favor. In this way, the seemingly strange sexual customs of the pharaohs, sibling marriage, divine conception, ritualized unions, and the complex life of the harem were all facets of a single theological system. Each expressed the conviction that life, power, and order were bound together through sexuality. The pharaoh's body served as the axis around which heaven and earth revolved. His seed was not merely biological, but cosmological, the substance through which the gods renewed the world. In the religious landscape of ancient Egypt, female sexuality occupied a paradoxical position, at once sacred and controlled, creative and contained. The Egyptian worldview regarded the feminine not as subordinate to the masculine, but as its essential complement. Creation required duality. Every god had a goddess. Every act of generation required balance between the active and the receptive. Within this framework, the sexual roles of royal women were elevated beyond the domestic sphere to the realm of cosmic necessity. The queen was not merely the pharaoh's partner. She was his ritual counterpart, the earthly vessel of divine femininity. The Egyptian pantheon offered abundant models for this principle. The goddess Isis embodied conjugal devotion, maternal protection, and the magical restoration of life. Her mythic union with Osiris was the archetype of divine sexuality, a marriage that transcended death. After Osiris was dismembered by his brother Seth, Isis reassembled his body and, through her magic, briefly reanimated him to conceive their son, Horus. The story was not interpreted as morbid, but as triumphant, a testament to the regenerative power of the female principle. Through Isis, life conquered death, and fertility overcame decay. Egyptian queens, particularly during the New Kingdom, often drew upon this mythology to define their own authority and sacred role. The cult of Hathor represented another facet of divine femininity. As goddess of love, beauty, and sensuality, Hathor governed both sexual pleasure and maternal nourishment. She was depicted as a cow or a woman with cow's horns and a solar disk, symbols linking her to both fertility and cosmic light. Temples dedicated to Hathor, such as those at Dendera, featured festivals marked by dance, music, and intoxication. These celebrations, though joyous and sensual, were not hedonistic in the modern sense. They were acts of ritual catharsis meant to revitalize the bond between the divine and the human world. In her role as mistress of drunkenness and lady of jubilation, Hathor absorbed the passions and excesses of humanity, transforming them into divine joy. Egyptian ritual texts suggest that the boundaries between sexuality, music, and spirituality were deliberately porous. To arouse joy was to reawaken the creative energies of the cosmos. Royal women, particularly queens and high priestesses, played indispensable roles in such rites. The queen was regarded as the living Hathor, the embodiment of joy and fertility, who united with the king in sacred ceremony to ensure the renewal of the land. Reliefs often depict queens offering sistrums, rattles associated with Hathor, to their husbands or to deities, symbolizing the invocation of divine pleasure and balance. The rhythmic shaking of the sistrum during ritual processions was believed to please the gods, drive away chaos, and awaken fertility. This musical act, performed by royal women, was simultaneously erotic and metaphysical. Sound itself became a form of arousal for the divine. The fusion of sexual and agricultural imagery appeared most vividly in the Festival of the Beautiful Meeting, an annual event celebrated primarily at Thebes. During this festival, The statue of the god Amun of Karnak was ceremonially carried to the temple of Mut, his consort, and united with her for several days of ritual communion. The procession along the Nile, accompanied by music, feasting, and public rejoicing, symbolized the reunion of the divine pair and the consequent renewal of the world. The sexual nature of the festival was implicit but central. The divine coupling ensured the continuation of creation, just as the Nile's inundation ensured the fertility of the fields. The return procession marked the conclusion of the rite and the restoration of cosmic order after union. The ritual relationship between Amun and Mut was mirrored in that of the pharaoh and his queen. The great royal wife was more than a consort. She was the terrestrial manifestation of the goddess. Her womb represented Egypt's potential to regenerate. Some inscriptions even described the queen as the horizon of birth, a metaphorical gateway through which divine kingship entered the mortal world. Queens such as Nefertari, Tiye, and Nefertiti were deified during their lifetimes, depicted in temples receiving offerings or making offerings alongside their husbands. Their beauty and fertility were political assets, binding the visible and the invisible realms. Artistic depictions of royal couples reinforce this theology of union. The reliefs of Akhenaten and Nefertiti from the Amarna period portray the pair under the radiant hands of the sun disk Aten, their daughters playing at their feet. These scenes are striking for their tenderness and intimacy, qualities rarely seen in earlier Egyptian art. Yet beneath the affection lies theology. The Aten's rays, ending in hands that extend the Ankh, the symbol of life, to the royal couple, signify the inseparability of love, fertility, and divine power. The family itself becomes a sacrament, an image of cosmic harmony manifest in human form. To love was to worship. To bear children was to sustain creation. Queens also played crucial roles in funerary rituals, another domain where sexuality and renewal intertwined. The opening of the mouth ceremony, performed for the deceased, symbolically restored breath and vitality to the body. In some representations, female participants, often designated as the goddesses Isis and Nephthys, stand on either side of the mummy, enacting the mythic role of the sisters who revived Osiris. Their gestures, laments, and ritual movements evoked both mourning and erotic reanimation, echoing the moment when Isis conceived Horus. Death, in Egyptian thought, was not the negation of life, but its transformation through the same creative forces that governed birth and conception. Even the language of royal epithets carried sexual resonance. Phrases such as, "he who inseminates the two lands," or "she who brings forth life," appear in inscriptions, uniting political sovereignty with fertility. The two lands, Upper and Lower Egypt, were often personified as women whom the pharaoh symbolically embraced or united. Such imagery transformed political unification into erotic metaphor, reinforcing the idea that the king's rule was a generative act, continually renewing the equilibrium of the cosmos. Through these practices, the Egyptians expressed a worldview in which sexuality was neither profane nor purely biological. It was a sacred language, a ritual vocabulary through which the rhythms of the universe were maintained. The union of man and woman, god and goddess, king and queen, represented the perpetual conversation between order and chaos, life and death, creation and decay. The feminine, in its nurturing and erotic dimensions, provided the indispensable counterbalance to masculine power. Without Isis, Osiris remained dismembered. Without Hathor, the world would lack joy. Without Mut, Amun's creative energy would remain unfulfilled. The result was a civilization that placed eroticism at the very heart of its theology. Far from the prudishness that would later characterize many religious traditions, Egypt embraced sexuality as sacred force. The pharaoh and his queen, joined in ritual and myth, were seen not as individuals, but as embodiments of the cosmic marriage upon which all existence depended. In their union, the gods continued their eternal act of creation, and through them the Nile once more began to rise. In the religious imagination of ancient Egypt, death was not the negation of life, but its necessary transformation. The passage from mortality to eternity was conceived as an act of regeneration, an awakening that echoed the first creation. This belief reached its fullest expression in the myth of Osiris, the god who died, was resurrected, and became the ruler of the afterlife. Central to his myth, and by extension to Egyptian funerary ideology, was the role of sexuality as the mechanism through which life reasserted itself over death. To understand how the Egyptians envisioned immortality, one must understand how they eroticized resurrection. The Osirian cycle begins with fratricide and dismemberment. Seth, driven by envy and chaos, murdered his brother Osiris, enclosed his body in a chest, and scattered his remains across Egypt. Isis, the faithful wife and sister, undertook a long quest to gather the fragments. In various local traditions, she reassembled the body with the help of Nephthys, Anubis, and Thoth. But one piece, the phallus, was missing, devoured by a fish in the Nile. Undeterred, Isis fashioned a replacement through magic, and, in a brief act of divine union, conceived her son, Horus. Thus, the phallus of Osiris, even in absence, became the symbol of indestructible life. It was the creative spark that death could not consume. The myth's sexual dimension was not viewed as obscene, it was sacred metaphysics. The regenerative act between Isis and Osiris was a template for the eternal process, by which fertility returns after desolation, the flooding of the Nile after drought, the green shoot after harvest, and the sunrise after night. For the Egyptians, to live eternally was to participate in that same rhythm of renewal. Death required the reassembly of the body and the reanimation of its generative powers. The funerary rituals that developed around this belief aimed to reconstruct the deceased in the image of Osiris and restore the vital potency that animated his resurrection. One of the most significant of these rituals was the opening of the mouth ceremony. Conducted during the burial process, this rite symbolically reopened the deceased's senses, enabling them to breathe, speak, eat, and, most importantly, procreate in the afterlife. The officiant, often a priest assuming the role of Horus, touched the mummy's mouth and other orifices with ritual instruments shaped like adzes or fingers, declaring that the organs had been opened to life once more. The language of the ritual frequently employed sexual imagery. Rebirth was depicted as the reactivation of bodily functions, particularly those associated with fertility. Through these gestures, the deceased was transformed into an Osiris, capable of eternal generation. In funerary art, this erotic symbolism appeared repeatedly. Coffins and tomb walls depicted the resurrection of Osiris as a moment of sexual awakening. The god is often shown with his erect phallus concealed beneath mummy wrappings, a discreet yet unmistakable sign that even in death the power of life persisted. The Djed pillar, a ubiquitous symbol in Egyptian religion, represented both Osiris' spine and the stability of the cosmos. Its verticality and frequent association with fertility rituals suggest that it functioned as a hieroglyph of resurrection and masculine potency. The annual raising of the Djed ceremony, performed during festivals in honor of Osiris, reenacted the god's restoration to uprightness, a literal and symbolic re-erection of life over death. Female participation in funerary rites mirrored Isis' role in the mythic narrative. Professional mourners, often identified as the two kites representing Isis and Nephthys, accompanied funerary processions with rhythmic lamentations, gestures, and bodily movements that scholars have described as ritualized expressions of grief and arousal. Their laments were not merely sorrowful, but performative. They invoked the magical power of speech and sound to awaken the deceased. The mourners' ululations, physical gestures, and exposed hair symbolized the chaotic energy from which renewal could emerge. The fusion of mourning and eroticism in these rituals exemplified the Egyptian conviction that creation and lamentation were two sides of the same process. Both brought life into being through intensity of emotion and movement. The connection between sexual potency and resurrection extended into mortuary architecture as well. The pyramid, with its upward-thrusting form and internal chambers aligned to celestial pathways, has long been interpreted as a symbol of the phallus and the generative power of the sun. The pyramidal shape embodied ascent, penetration of the heavens, and the rebirth of the king among the imperishable stars. Texts inscribed within the Pyramid of Unas, c. 2300 BCE, refer to the deceased king mounting to the sky as a falcon with an erect phallus, an explicit link between sexual vigor and divine ascension. The celestial union of the deceased with the goddess Nut, who stretches across the heavens, was imagined as a continuation of this erotic resurrection. The sky goddess received the king into her body each night and gave birth to him again at dawn. In the Book of the Dead and other funerary texts, rebirth in the afterlife was frequently expressed through sexual metaphors. The deceased was said to inseminate the fields of reeds, or to mount the sky as a bull mounts the cow. Such imagery was not metaphorical in the modern sense, but functional. It described the actual process by which the individual re-entered the cycles of fertility that sustained the universe. The field of reeds, the Egyptian paradise, was a perfected version of the Nile Valley, where souls worked the soil and enjoyed perpetual harvests. Eternal life was, quite literally, eternal fecundity. The physical preparation of the body also reflected these beliefs. Embalming preserved not only the form, but the generative capacity of the deceased. The organs were carefully removed and treated, while the heart, believed to be the seat of thought and emotion, remained within the chest. The genitals were preserved or wrapped with particular care, ensuring that the deceased retained their capacity for regeneration. In some cases, artificial phalluses were placed on male mummies, and female mummies were positioned with symbols of fertility such as scarabs or lotus flowers. The lotus, which opens by day and closes by night, was itself a potent sexual emblem of rebirth. In some myths, the infant sun god emerged from its petals at dawn, a divine reenactment of orgasmic creation. Sexual imagery also appeared in the relationships between gods and goddesses of the underworld. In later funerary theology, Osiris was sometimes joined with Hathor or the resurrected Isis in acts that symbolized the union of death and life, darkness and light. The deceased, identified with Osiris, participated in these unions, thus ensuring his perpetual vitality. The coffin texts and Book of Gates describe the soul's nightly journey through the underworld as a sequence of encounters, transformations, and unions, both violent and erotic, that culminate in rebirth with the rising sun. Each dawn reenacted the cosmic copulation of heaven and earth, reaffirming the principle that sexual generation was the engine of eternity. This pervasive eroticism in Egyptian mortuary culture reveals a worldview that refused to separate the physical from the spiritual. To be reborn was to be aroused, to awaken once more to life's creative pulse. The same energy that governed procreation on earth governed resurrection in the beyond. For the ancient Egyptians, sex was not confined to the domain of pleasure. It was the most visible form of divine power, a glimpse of the mechanism by which the gods themselves maintained the rhythm of existence. To die, therefore, was not to end, but to re-enter the eternal embrace between body and cosmos, a union forever consummated beneath the rising sun. Ancient Egyptian religion did not confine sexuality to myth or royal ritual. It extended into the intimate fabric of everyday life through magic, medicine, and protective charms. Erotic power, to the Egyptians, was a tangible force, capable of healing, binding, reviving, or destroying. The same energy that animated the gods and sustained creation could be harnessed through words, gestures, and symbols. In this sense, sexual magic, Heka-seshemu, the magic of desire, represented a practical theology, the belief that divine potency flowed through human bodies and could be directed by human will. The foundation of Egyptian magic lay in the concept of Heka, the universal energy through which creation was enacted and maintained. Heka was not merely magic in the modern sense, but a divine faculty granted by the Creator to gods and humans alike. It was both a deity and a principle. Sexual magic formed one of its most vivid expressions. Incantations, amulets, and ritual objects invoked the generative powers of the body to achieve spiritual or material ends, fertility, love, protection, or resurrection. Erotic spells survive in abundance from papyri, such as the Papyrus Harris 501 and the London Magical Papyrus, dating from the New Kingdom and later periods. These texts include love charms intended to attract a partner, restore lost affection, or induce passion. One incantation calls upon Hathor and Isis, commanding a lover to burn with desire as the desert burns with the sun. The language of fire, heat, and compulsion illustrates how sexual energy was imagined as both natural and divine, an elemental force that could be invoked through proper ritual. In another spell, a wax figurine representing the beloved is heated over a flame while the practitioner recites invocations. The sympathetic magic transfers the warmth to the heart of the desired person. Such rites reflect the Egyptian conviction that emotional and physical attraction were threads of the same cosmic fabric. Fertility magic occupied a prominent role in household religion. Women seeking conception wore amulets shaped like the goddess Taweret, a hippopotamus with pendulous breasts and a pregnant belly, or the dwarf god Bes, who protected childbirth and warded off malevolent forces. These deities, humorous in form yet potent in symbolism, embodied the protective and sensual aspects of divine sexuality. Amulets depicting male and female genitalia were common and openly displayed. Their presence was not considered indecent but apotropaic. The phallus, in particular, symbolized vitality and was used to repel evil spirits, much as the erect image of Min had served to guarantee fertility in temple ritual. Medical papyri such as the Ebers Papyrus, c. 1550 BCE, reveal how sexual potency and reproductive health were treated within the same continuum of religion and medicine. Remedies for impotence included recitations to Hathor and applications of honey or crushed dates, ingredients associated with sweetness, fertility, and divine favor. Contraceptive mixtures, such as pessaries made from crocodile dung and natron, demonstrate a pragmatic understanding of sexuality as both sacred and physiological. Whether to promote conception or prevent it, Egyptians approached sexual health through ritualized practice that blurred the boundaries between medicine, prayer, and spellcraft. Erotic imagery also appeared on everyday objects, particularly during the New Kingdom. Ivory wands, cosmetic spoons, and mirrors were carved with figures of nude women, lotus flowers, or swimming fish, all symbols of sensuality and rebirth. The act of adorning oneself was, in essence, a magical one. To beautify the body was to align it with the radiant order of the gods. Mirrors were associated with Hathor, the goddess who reflected divine beauty into the mortal world. Some were engraved with prayers invoking her golden face to grant attraction and joy. In this way, the Egyptian toilet box and cosmetic table became altars of transformation, where the mundane ritual of grooming merged with divine sexuality. The intertwining of eroticism and protection extended to funerary practices. Amulets depicting copulating pairs or ithyphallic gods were placed among mummy wrappings to ensure rebirth. The symbolism was consistent with the Osirian model. Sexual power guaranteed continuity beyond death. In some tombs, particularly in Deir el-Medina, wall paintings show couples embracing or banquet scenes filled with sensual overtones, perfume cones, music, and naked dancers. These depictions celebrated not licentiousness, but vitality. To enjoy pleasure was to participate in the eternal rhythm of creation. The afterlife was imagined not as abstinent purity, but as perfected delight, where sensual fulfillment accompanied eternal peace. The use of sexual magic was not limited to fertility or affection. It could also serve coercive or vengeful purposes. Certain spells in the demotic magical papyrus sought to inflame or torment the heart of an unfaithful lover until they returned to the spellcaster. The principle was the same as that of beneficial love charms, directing the currents of desire through symbolic means, but the intent was darker. The boundary between healing and harm was fluid, determined by motive rather than method. To master Heka was to wield the forces of the cosmos and therefore to risk their consequences. Temples institutionalized aspects of sexual magic through ritual performance. Priestesses of Hathor and Isis conducted rites of music, dance, and intoxication meant to arouse divine presence. Wine and incense were believed to open the senses to the unseen world, allowing participants to experience the same ecstatic joy that bound gods and humans together. These ceremonies, sometimes accompanied by rhythmic drumming and chanting, created communal catharsis. The passion expressed in ritual mirrored the generative forces that sustained the universe. The line between sacred ecstasy and erotic stimulation was intentionally blurred. Both were considered pathways to divine contact. Erotic symbolism even infiltrated architecture. The columns of temples dedicated to fertility gods were sometimes carved in the form of papyrus or lotus stems, their flaring capitals echoing the female form, while the shafts suggested the male principle. Doorways, too, were liminal spaces symbolizing union. To pass through was to reenact penetration into the divine realm. In this architectural theology, stone and body were analogous materials through which creation was continually renewed. Every aspect of Egyptian sexual magic reflected the belief that desire was the animating pulse of the cosmos. It connected the living with the gods, the fertile earth with the rising sun, and the present world with the eternal. Through words, symbols, and gestures, Egyptians sought to harness that pulse, to heal, to conceive, to attract, or to endure. Unlike later moral systems that segregated sex from sanctity, Egyptian religion absorbed eroticism into its most sacred vocabulary. Pleasure, fertility, and enchantment were not vices to overcome, but energies to align with cosmic order. In this synthesis of the sensual and the spiritual, ancient Egypt articulated one of the most enduring theological paradoxes in human history, that the power to create and the power to love were one and the same. The Egyptian royal harem was far more than a secluded residence of pleasure. It was a political microcosm, an administrative institution in which sexuality, diplomacy, and power intersected. The word harem, borrowed from later Islamic terminology, is somewhat misleading when applied to ancient Egypt. The native Egyptian term, perkena, translates roughly as house of seclusion or residence of royal women. Within its walls lived not only the pharaoh's wives and concubines, but also princesses, attendants, servants, musicians, tutors, and guards. It was both sanctuary and theatre where private desire, dynastic strategy and political conspiracy coexisted. The great royal wife occupied the apex of this hierarchy. She embodied divine femininity, serving as ritual partner to the king in festivals and religious ceremonies. Her marriage established the legitimacy of the royal line, often linking the king to a previous dynasty or powerful priestly family. Beneath her stood the king's wives and king's women, a category that included concubines of noble or foreign birth. Marriages to foreign princesses, particularly during the New Kingdom, served diplomatic purposes, cementing alliances with neighboring powers such as the Mitanni, Hittites, and Babylonians. The Amarna letters, a cache of 14th century BCE diplomatic correspondence, record requests from foreign rulers for marriage alliances with Egyptian kings. These unions reinforced Egypt's status as the center of the known world, where international relations were conducted through the exchange of bloodlines as much as treaties. Despite its grandeur, the harem could become a breeding ground for rivalry and intrigue. The isolation of royal women, combined with the high stakes of succession, made competition inevitable. The most famous case is the harem conspiracy during the reign of Ramesses III, c. 1155 BCE. The judicial papyrus of Turin details a plot led by Tie, a secondary wife, to assassinate the pharaoh and place her son Pentuer on the throne. The conspirators included palace officials, guards, and magicians. Their weapons were not only physical, but magical. Spells and wax figures were used in attempts to paralyze or harm the king. The plot failed, and the conspirators were executed or forced to commit suicide. Yet the affair exposes the volatile intersection of desire, ambition, and ritual power within the royal household. The harem was not merely a space of indulgence, but a crucible where the erotic could turn political, and the political could become deadly. The organization of the harem was itself bureaucratic. Overseers, scribes, and stewards managed its estates, workshops, and domestic affairs. Women of the harem produced textiles, perfumes, and musical performances for court ceremonies. Records from the Ramesside period indicate that the harem functioned as a self-sufficient economic unit, with land holdings and agricultural output comparable to temple estates. This combination of economic independence and proximity to the throne gave its occupants an unusual degree of potential influence. The harem's reputation as a place of seclusion belied its active participation in the cultural and political life of Egypt. Sexuality within the harem followed the same theological framework that governed the rest of Egyptian life. The pharaoh's relationships were sacred unions, not mere indulgences. He was the living Horus, and his role as the divine seed-bearer required the continual renewal of fertility through ritualized coupling. The king's virility symbolized the vitality of the nation. To display his potency was to affirm cosmic order. Scenes on temple walls showing the king embraced by goddesses such as Hathor or Isis are metaphors for this perpetual renewal. The women of the harem, by extension, participated in maintaining the divine cycle of creation, embodying the goddesses' generative roles on earth. Nevertheless, passion and jealousy were never absent. Poetry from the New Kingdom reveals a sophisticated emotional life within the court. Love songs preserved on ostraca from Thebes describe longing, flirtation, and erotic delight in language that merges sensuality with spirituality. One poem likens the beloved to the lotus flower that opens with the sun. When she appears, my heart dances. When she leaves, my limbs grow weak. Such verses, though likely composed outside royal circles, reflect an aesthetic sensibility shared by all levels of Egyptian society, a belief that love itself was a manifestation of divine harmony. The harem's cultural influence extended beyond the palace walls. Dancers, musicians, and courtesans trained within its precincts performed at festivals and religious ceremonies. Music and dance, particularly when associated with Hathor, carried erotic and ecstatic overtones. Instruments such as the sistrum and the lute were linked to fertility and pleasure. In temples and banquet scenes, female performers appear naked or lightly clothed, their movements stylized yet charged with meaning. The body, in Egyptian art, was not a source of shame but of divine expression. To move rhythmically was to echo the heartbeat of the cosmos. Queens also exercised political power through sensual symbolism. Nefertari, consort of Ramesses II, was portrayed as the embodiment of Hathor in temple reliefs at Abu Simbel, where her image stands equal in scale to that of the king, a rare honor. Her depictions emphasize grace and fertility, attributes that in Egyptian iconography signified authority. In the Amarna period, Nefertiti's prominence in art and ceremony made her almost co-regent. Her beauty was not merely aesthetic, but ideological. It was a visual theology of balance, proportion, and divine order. Through her, Akhenaten's religious revolution gained legitimacy, merging physical allure with metaphysical reform. Beyond the palace, eroticism also shaped diplomacy and mythic propaganda. Foreign envoys often brought exotic dancers and musicians as tribute, reinforcing Egypt's status as the land where pleasure and divinity intertwined. Royal inscriptions celebrated not only military victories, but the king's attractiveness and virility. Amenhotep III, for example, was praised as the dazzling son of women, a phrase that linked his sexual charisma with solar power. His palace at Malkata included pleasure gardens, perfumed pools, and luxurious pavilions designed for leisure and ritual. Far from trivial extravagance, these environments embodied the theology of abundance that defined Egyptian kingship, yet the same forces that sanctified pleasure could also generate instability. The harem, filled with women of noble birth and foreign allegiance, was a nexus of competing loyalties. A single act of favoritism could tilt the balance of power. To manage this delicate system, the pharaoh relied on eunuchs, stewards, and guards, figures who served as intermediaries between seclusion and sovereignty. The existence of such functionaries demonstrates that Egypt's rulers understood the dual nature of erotic power, indispensable to kingship, yet perilous if left unchecked. In the final analysis, the Egyptian royal harem was not an indulgent aberration, but an institutional reflection of a deeper cosmology. It was the domestic echo of the celestial court, where multiple goddesses surrounded the sun god and ministered to his eternal regeneration. Within its walls, the personal merged with the political, the sensual with the sacred. Every union, every rivalry, every song of longing performed beneath its painted ceilings participated in the grand drama of creation that the Egyptians believed governed the world. The pharaoh's pleasure was Egypt's prosperity, his desire the rhythm of the Nile itself. Sexuality in ancient Egypt was not confined to royal ritual or mythic symbolism. It was a visible, celebrated, and integrated part of daily life, reflected in art, literature, and humor. Egyptians did not conceive of eroticism as a private indulgence divorced from morality or piety. Rather, it was an affirmation of vitality and divine order, a sign that the universe was functioning as it should. The body was sacred, pleasure was natural, and fertility was the pulse of creation itself. Egyptian art was renowned for its restraint and idealization, yet beneath its formal elegance lay a sensual language understood by ancient viewers. Nudity, far from being taboo, was a recurring motif symbolizing purity, fertility, or youth. Female dancers, servants, and goddesses were often depicted unclothed or semi-nude, their forms stylized to express beauty and vigor rather than lust. The roundness of hips, fullness of breasts, and smoothness of skin were visual metaphors for abundance, the same qualities that defined fertile soil and bountiful harvests. The erotic element in art became particularly pronounced in domestic and funerary contexts. Scenes on tomb walls frequently depicted banquets with music, wine, and dancing girls. These gatherings, though sensual, carried religious significance. They reenacted the joy of life and the hope for eternal rejuvenation in the afterlife. The music, perfume, and nudity were not provocations but invocations, calls to the gods of fertility and pleasure to bless both the living and the dead. Erotic imagery, therefore, was a mode of resurrection, linking the pleasures of this world to the perfection of the next. The most striking surviving example of Egyptian erotic art is the Turin erotic papyrus, dating to the Ramesside period, c. 1200 BCE. This unique scroll, often described as the world's earliest pornographic illustration, portrays men and women engaged in a variety of sexual acts, accompanied by scenes of humor and satire. Scholars caution that the papyrus was not intended as pornography in the modern sense. Its exaggerated forms, comedic tone, and pairing of sexual scenes with depictions of animals performing human activities suggest parody and social commentary rather than titillation. The figures, exaggerated physiques, and improbable positions reflect a deliberate inversion of social norms, a carnivalesque expression of vitality and absurdity. In Egyptian thought, laughter and sex shared a common purpose. Both dispelled stagnation and reasserted life. The papyrus reveals that Egyptians could approach sex with both reverence and irony. Erotic pleasure was divine in its essence, but human in its folly. The coexistence of sacred fertility rituals and bawdy humor underscores the flexibility of Egyptian culture in accommodating opposites. The same civilization that carved solemn hymns to Min and Isis could also delight in ribald jokes and satirical drawings. This equilibrium between reverence and amusement, decorum and delight, was one of the hallmarks of Egyptian sensibility. In ordinary households, sexuality was an accepted and celebrated aspect of domestic life. Marriage in Egypt was not a religious sacrament, but a social and economic contract grounded in mutual affection and partnership. Love poems from the New Kingdom depict relationships between men and women in tender and sensual language. A woman in one verse declares, "My heart desires to go walking with you. I will wash myself before you and adorn myself with the finest oils." The simplicity of these verses conveys genuine intimacy, affection rooted in shared experience rather than hierarchical dominance. Married couples were expected to bear children, and fertility was a matter of communal joy rather than private pressure. Conception, pregnancy, and childbirth were surrounded by rituals invoking protective deities such as Hathor, Taweret, and Bez. Erotic amulets and charms were common wedding gifts, their open imagery expressing hope for a fruitful union. Divorce was permitted, and surviving legal documents show that women retained rights to property and dowry, a degree of autonomy unusual in the ancient world. This balance of sensuality and pragmatism reflected the Egyptian ability to integrate desire with duty. Egyptian humor often employed erotic motifs to comment on power and hypocrisy. Ostraca from Deir el-Medina, a village of artisans who built royal tombs, contained sketches of animals acting like humans, including donkeys copulating or monkeys playing harps. These drawings, often labeled satirical, were expressions of social inversion. The high brought low, the sacred mocked through the profane. Sexual humor functioned as both entertainment and catharsis. By laughing at the body, Egyptians reaffirmed their acceptance of its divine imperfection. The interplay between laughter and sex was rooted in mythology. According to one version of the Book of the Heavenly Cow, the goddess Hathor, transformed into the Eye of Ra, nearly destroyed humankind in a fit of divine wrath. To stop her, the gods brewed vast quantities of beer dyed red to resemble blood. When Hathor drank it, she became intoxicated, laughed, and forgot her anger. Her laughter, born of inebriation and pleasure, saved the world. In Egyptian thought, laughter and intoxication were not sins. They were restorative forces that returned creation to harmony. Erotic joy, like laughter, renewed cosmic order. Egyptian artists viewed the human form as a microcosm of divine proportion. The same mathematical precision that governed temple architecture was applied to the representation of bodies. Male figures were shown with taut musculature and broad shoulders, while female forms emphasized softness and curvature. The balance of masculine and feminine, strength and grace, symbolized universal harmony. In artistic conventions, the ideal body was ageless, a state of perpetual sexual maturity reflecting divine perfection. Jewelry, cosmetics, and clothing further emphasized the aesthetic dimension of sensuality. Both men and women adorned themselves with scented oils, kohl eyeliner, and linen garments that clung to the body. These practices were not frivolous, but devotional. To beautify oneself was to honor the gods, particularly Hathor and Isis. Perfume, made from lotus oil, myrrh, and cinnamon, carried connotations of erotic awakening. Its fragrance was believed to attract divine favor and romantic desire alike. The act of anointing the body was itself a ritual, transforming the individual into a living image of fertility and grace. Egyptian eroticism was closely tied to the cycles of nature. The lotus, which bloomed with the rising sun and closed at night, symbolized both sexual awakening and cosmic rebirth. The papyrus, associated with the Nile's inundation, represented fecundity and male potency. Animals, too, carried erotic symbolism. Bulls, rams, and crocodiles signified virility, while cats and birds of prey symbolized feminine allure. These motifs pervaded both art and language. To smell the lotus was a euphemism for sexual pleasure. To ride the papyrus boat signified the act of love. Such metaphors reflected a worldview in which the human body and the natural world were continuous expressions of the same divine life force. In Egyptian culture, eroticism was not an isolated domain of experience, but a universal rhythm. It animated myth, politics, humor, and art. It infused the daily rituals of bathing, dressing, and eating. Pleasure was not opposed to spirituality. It was one of its manifestations. To experience desire was to feel the gods moving within the body. To make love was to participate in the endless renewal of the cosmos. Egyptian art, whether solemn or playful, celebrated this truth with unembarrassed candor. Its images remind modern viewers that for the ancient Egyptians, sexuality was not a secret to be hidden, but a mystery to be understood, a force that made both mortals and gods alike part of the same eternal dance. Ancient Egyptian conceptions of gender and sexuality were more fluid and nuanced than those of many later civilizations. The Egyptians did not divide human identity into rigid categories of moral or social propriety based on sexual behavior. Instead, they viewed sexuality primarily through the lens of cosmic balance, Ma'at, the principle of harmony that governed all creation. Acts that upheld balance were considered natural. Those that disrupted it were associated with disorder or isfet. Within this framework, gender and sexual expression were seen as part of a divine continuum rather than moral absolutes. The gods themselves embodied complex gender identities. Creation myths often portrayed divinity as androgynous or self-generating. Atum, for instance, was both male and female in essence, capable of producing offspring without a partner. The goddess Mut was sometimes described as the mother who fathered her own children. The fusion of male and female principles was not viewed as paradoxical, but as necessary for creation. This theological duality shaped Egyptian perceptions of gender in the mortal realm. Every person, in some sense, contained both generative principles, Pharaohs frequently adopted both masculine and feminine attributes to express their divine completeness. Female rulers, such as Hatshepsut, styled themselves with masculine titles and wore the false beard of kingship, not as denial of womanhood but as assertion of divine unity. Male kings, in turn, were sometimes described in maternal metaphors, nursing Egypt or giving birth to the two lands. In this symbolic language, gender was functional, not fixed. Power and fertility could flow through either body. The crucial question was whether the ruler maintained harmony between masculine and feminine forces. Evidence concerning homosexuality in ancient Egypt is fragmentary, but what survives suggests a society less preoccupied with sexual orientation than with propriety and balance. The most explicit mythic reference appears in the contendings of Horus and Seth, a New Kingdom text preserved on papyrus Chester Beatty Vs. In this narrative, Seth attempts to assert dominance over Horus by sexually assaulting him. The act is not condemned for its homoerotic nature, but for its violation of cosmic order and royal legitimacy. Seth's attempt represents chaos, seeking to overthrow rightful rule. Horus' clever reversal, catching Seth's semen and replacing it with his own to prove dominance before the gods, illustrates how sexuality functioned as a metaphor for political power and moral inversion rather than personal desire. In Egyptian ideology, sexual acts carried symbolic weight depending on context, status, and consent. Penetration was often equated with mastery. To be penetrated was to be subdued or subordinated. Thus, when texts or insults reference male-male intercourse, they do so in political or moral terms, not as commentary on orientation. For example, some ostraca and satirical texts mock rivals by implying sexual passivity, equating it with weakness or social inferiority. Yet, these jests lack the religious condemnation that later cultures attached to same-sex relations. Egyptian society valued balance and dominance hierarchies, not the gender of partners. Material evidence also suggests the presence of affectionate relationships between men. The most famous example is the tomb of Niankhkhnum and Khnumhotep at Saqqara, dating to the 5th dynasty, c. to 2400 BCE. The two men, both royal manicurists, are depicted in poses traditionally reserved for husband and wife, embracing face-to-face and sharing the kiss of life. Their names are written together in ways that blend into one another, reading as joined in life and death. Some scholars interpret this as evidence of a homosexual partnership, while others argue it signifies fraternal affection or professional camaraderie. Regardless of interpretation, the tomb demonstrates that intimate same-sex relationships could be memorialized without stigma or erasure. The inclusion of such imagery within a royal necropolis suggests that emotional bonds between men were neither hidden nor condemned. Erotic humor from the New Kingdom further indicates an acceptance of sexual diversity within certain bounds. Ostraca from Deir el-Medina feature caricatures of both heterosexual and homosexual encounters, rendered in the same playful spirit as other satirical art. Such depictions were less about moral judgment and more about the acknowledgement of human behavior in all its variety. The Egyptians, pragmatic and sensual, were more inclined to laugh at sexual eccentricity than to legislate against it. Certain religious offices in Egypt required the embodiment of gender duality. Priests of particular deities, such as Hathor and Mut, participated in rituals that blurred conventional gender lines. Men could don feminine garments or adopt gestures associated with goddesses as a form of sacred mimicry. This practice symbolized union with the divine and the temporary dissolution of human distinctions. The transvestite priest motif, found in temple inscriptions, reflects not social transgression, but ritual necessity. By assuming attributes of both sexes, the officiant mirrored the creative balance inherent in the gods themselves. Egyptian language further reveals this fluidity. The word ka, denoting the vital essence or life force, was grammatically masculine, while the word ba, representing the soul or personality, was feminine. Every person, therefore, was linguistically composed of both masculine and feminine elements. To be whole was to harmonize these internal forces. Sexual identity, in this metaphysical sense, transcended physical anatomy. Ancient Egyptian texts also preserve evidence of same-sex affection in non-sexual forms. Letters, poems, and funerary inscriptions frequently express deep bonds of love and loyalty between men. Soldiers and craftsmen address one another with terms of endearment, swearing eternal friendship and invoking divine blessing upon their union in the afterlife. These expressions, while not explicitly erotic, suggest that emotional intimacy between men was accepted and even celebrated. The instruction of Ptah-hotep, one of Egypt's oldest wisdom texts, advises mutual respect and affection between companions, describing friendship as a reflection of divine harmony. The Egyptians lacked the moral vocabulary of sin or guilt that would later dominate Western discussions of sexuality. What mattered was the preservation of Ma'at, the order that sustained the world. Sexual acts, whether between men and women or individuals of the same sex, were judged not by orientation, but by their consequences. Did they promote balance, fertility, and respect, or did they introduce chaos and conflict? In this ethical framework, desire was morally neutral. It was the misuse of power or disruption of harmony that provoked censure. The Egyptian approach to gender and sexuality demonstrates an extraordinary integration of physical, emotional, and spiritual realities. The pharaoh, embodying both masculine and feminine principles, ruled as the mediator of cosmic duality. The gods, self-generating and fluid in form, modeled a world where creation required cooperation between opposites rather than competition. Within this cosmos, love, whether heterosexual or homosexual, divine or mortal, was simply another expression of the eternal desire that sustained life. The absence of moral condemnation does not imply libertinism, but equilibrium. Egyptian art and literature reveal a culture confident in the sanctity of the body and comfortable with its pleasures. Gender and sexuality were not social prisons, but symbolic languages through which the Egyptians articulated their deepest truth, that life, in all its forms and unions, was sacred. The eternal dance between male and female, giver and receiver, active and receptive. This was not a boundary to police, but a rhythm to preserve. By the time of the late dynasties and the rise of foreign rule, from the Persians to the Greeks and Romans, the ancient Egyptian vision of sexuality as sacred order had already shaped the imagination of the Mediterranean world. Egyptian theology had woven a system in which creation, fertility, and desire were inseparable forces. Unlike later moral systems that would divide body from spirit and pleasure from piety, Egypt had seen no contradiction in celebrating both. The sexual act, whether in myth, ritual, or daily life, remained for millennia the fundamental metaphor for the harmony of the cosmos. The Ptolemaic and Roman periods brought new cultural overlays to Egypt's ancient philosophy. Greek influence introduced more dualistic ideas about the body and soul, rooted in Platonic thought, while Roman governance imposed stricter social hierarchies and moral codes. Yet even under these foreign systems, Egyptian temples continued to preserve their old cosmological vocabulary. The rituals of divine conception and sacred marriage persisted at Dendera, Philae, and Edfu, where priests still enacted the erotic union of gods and goddesses to renew the cosmos annually. The goddess Isis, long the emblem of sacred femininity, became a universal deity under Greco-Roman syncretism. Her cult spread from Alexandria across the Mediterranean, inspiring temples from Pompeii to London. In Roman art and literature, Isis was reimagined as a motherly savior, yet the sensual undertones of her Egyptian identity remained intact. Her worshippers practiced rituals of purification, anointing, and ecstatic devotion, continuations of the ancient rites of fertility and renewal. The phrase inscribed in her temples, "I am all that has been and is and shall be," captured the Egyptian conviction that the divine encompasses all opposites, life and death, love and loss, male and female. Even as Egyptian religion declined under Christianization, its influence endured in the symbolic vocabulary of the Mediterranean world. The Virgin Mary, depicted nursing the infant Jesus, echoed the imagery of Isis nursing Horus, a motif of maternal divinity and erotic compassion transposed into a new theological key. In early Christian asceticism, Egyptian monks wrestled with the body's desires not as alien temptations, but as remnants of divine vitality to be mastered, not extinguished. Their struggle to reconcile spirit and flesh was the distant echo of Egypt's more ancient harmony between the two. At its core, Egyptian sexual philosophy rested on a cosmological principle: all generative power, whether biological, agricultural, or spiritual, was an expression of the same creative energy that had brought the universe into being. The gods modeled this pattern in their mythic relationships: Atum's self-creation, the coupling of Geb and Nut, the resurrection of Osiris through Isis' embrace, all taught that life renews itself through erotic synthesis. This worldview produced a culture in which the body was not a prison of the soul, but its instrument. The Egyptians mummified the body, not because they feared death, but because they regarded the physical form as sacred architecture capable of housing the soul in eternity. Sexual symbolism, from the phallus of Osiris to the womb of Nut, was a theology of form and matter. The body was divine geometry in motion, its pleasure a foretaste of immortality. Modern notions of sexual morality would have puzzled an ancient Egyptian priest. For them, purity was not abstinence, but alignment, keeping the rhythms of human life in harmony with the cycles of the Nile, the stars, and the gods. Fertility, appetite and love were not sins to be suppressed, but powers to be honored and directed. Excess and disorder, not sexuality itself, threatened the balance of Ma'at. The chaos of Seth, the sterile desert, and the breaking of cosmic law were the true evils. Desire, when disciplined through ritual and reverence, was the mechanism of creation itself. Egypt's sacred eroticism radiated outward through trade, conquest, and cultural exchange. Greek philosophers and mystery cults borrowed freely from Egyptian symbols and rituals. The Eleusinian mysteries, celebrating fertility and resurrection, bore traces of Isis and Osiris mythology. The Hermetic writings of late antiquity, attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, the Hellenized form of Thoth, blended Egyptian cosmology with Greek philosophy, emphasizing that divine knowledge arises from uniting opposites, light and dark, male and female, intellect and matter. In the Roman world, temples to Isis, Serapis, and Hathor offered rituals of initiation that promised personal renewal through sacred union. These cults appealed particularly to women and marginalized groups, offering spiritual intimacy in contrast to the austere state religions. The sensuality of these rites, often involving music, fragrance, and rhythmic movement, was a direct inheritance from the Nile temples. Even as Rome sought to regulate morality, Egyptian religion preserved the idea that divine contact required emotional and bodily engagement. With the rise of Christianity and later Islam, explicit sexual symbolism retreated from public theology, yet it persisted in esoteric traditions. alchemy, Gnosticism, and mystical poetry. The alchemical union of sulfur and mercury, or the mystical marriage of soul and spirit, were intellectual descendants of Egypt's sacred marriage rites. The Hermetic axiom, as above, so below, echoes the Egyptian belief that cosmic and human acts mirrored one another. To unite bodies was to imitate the union of the heavens. Modern fascination with Egyptian sexuality often oscillates between moral shock and romantic admiration. 19th century Egyptologists, constrained by Victorian prudery, censored or ignored erotic material in tombs and papyri. The Turin erotic papyrus was hidden from public view for decades. Only in the late 20th century did scholars begin to approach these materials without moral bias, recognizing that they expressed a coherent religious philosophy rather than mere indulgence. Contemporary studies of gender and religion have increasingly acknowledged Egypt's role as a pioneer in conceptualizing sexuality as a sacred principle. Feminist historians have re-examined the figure of Isis as a symbol of empowered femininity. Anthropologists of religion have noted the Egyptian integration of erotic joy into spiritual practice. In the field of comparative mythology, Egypt's legacy stands as a counterpoint to traditions that treat sexuality as fallen or corrupt. The Egyptian model offers an ancient reminder that the erotic and the divine are not enemies, but allies in the cycle of creation. In the final analysis, the sexual practices and ideologies of the Egyptian pharaohs were not aberrations, but extensions of a worldview that saw life as one continuous act of generation. From Atum's self-creation to the said festivals of royal renewal, from the rituals of the harem to the funerary rites of Osiris, every gesture of desire mirrored the cosmic rhythm of birth, death, and resurrection. The pharaoh's body was Egypt's cosmos, his unions, divine rehearsals of the world's first dawn. The strangest sexual practices of the pharaohs, ritual masturbation, divine incest, sacred prostitution, or the public erection of ithyphallic statues, were not eccentricities of decadence, but sacred dramas. They articulated truths about existence that transcended their time, that creation springs from desire, that life is sustained through union, and that even death is but a moment of divine reassembly. Egypt's understanding of eroticism was never merely physical. It was theological poetry, carved in stone and sung in hymns. It taught that to love, to create, to feel pleasure, was to participate in the work of the gods. The human body, radiant and flawed, was the vessel of eternity. When the Nile rose each year, swelling with life-giving silt, Egyptians saw in its waters the body of Osiris, fertile, resurrected, and eternal. Their festivals, prayers, and passions echoed this faith, that the pulse of desire is the pulse of the world itself, and that in the embrace of body and spirit, heaven and earth meet forever.